Hi everyone, today's lecture will cover two main topics. These are the Gestalt Principles of Grouping and Basic Composition. So to start off, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Composition and grouping are obviously interrelated. We carefully group and place elements together on a page to create differentiation and to also create hierarchy, so we can direct the reader through the elements and so they can also understand the message. We are also using the composition to tell a story and evoke a tone. Alright, let's first look at grouping. You've already probably discussed Gestalt principles in another class. In this class, I'm going to focus on Gestalt principles of grouping. For me, these principles are the strongest tools that a designer can use to create effective communication and design. So there are a couple of different sources and opinions, but I pretty much broke it down into 7 principles. The first 4 being probably the most relevant to a designer. So why is grouping important? By grouping information together, we can organize information so it is more easily understood by the viewer. And by grouping elements together, we can also help control the eye of the reader, directing them through the page, making them absorb the information in an appropriate manner. We can also create visual order, which creates unity in the design. So first off, we have the figure ground principle, which examines how the eye can separate shapes from the background and the foreground. In short, we can distinguish the foreground and the background, and fundamentally, this allows people to be able to see, process, and read the design. Second, we have the law of proximity, and this one's really simple in that things that are close together are perceived as related. So next we have the principle of similarity. This pretty much says that elements that share similar visual characteristics are perceived to be more related than those not sharing those same similar characteristics. So next we have uniform connectedness or common region. Similar to the proximity principle, elements that are placed within the same region are perceived as grouped. So by region, in this sense, we're talking about elements that are framed by either lines or shapes, whether it's in a rectangle or any other shape. These will be perceived as part of a group, distinct than anything else that is not within this group. This is especially interesting because it works even if it contradicts others' principles, say in similarity. This principle is especially useful for a designer. Say you have information that is related to the main content but stands alone, say a related workshop to a performance. You can put the related workshop information into a common region or frame to distinguish it from the main content. This area can use the same typography, but it will be read as separate. So for me, those last 4 principles are probably the most important principles for a designer, but here are a few others. Next, we have the principle of continuation. The eye perceives the path behind the structure. We can complete or understand groups of elements even if it is interrupted or combined with other groups. I think a good example of this would be the East Van sign, where we read the word east from left to right, and then we read the word van from top to bottom. And we can make sense of this even though they both share the same A. So next we have our 6th principle, the principle of closure. This principle states that we complete images that are missing information, either hidden or incomplete. This is often used with logos where limited shapes are used to suggest a larger image. We can definitely see this in the World Wildlife Foundation logo of the panda, where we automatically complete the logo of the top of the panda's head and body because of the suggested shapes of the ears and the arms. Finally, we have our 7th principle, the principle of common fate. This is a really interesting one in that things that move together or come from the same source are seen as part of the same group. You can use this principle to create some interesting designs. We can take a look at these posters found in Kimberly Elam's book, Compositional Systems. We have a design where all the information extends outward from a single point, as if they're exploding from it. She calls this system a radial composition. In the next example, we also have a few posters which uses circles of text, or as Elam calls it, a dilational compositional system. In this system, it seems as if the circles of text are coming out like ripples in a pond. This information is connected by the sense that they all come from the same source. So let's now start to talk about composition. So when I'm talking about composition, I'm really talking about the relationship between the page and the placement and proportions of elements on that page. And I ask, how can they all be interrelated? The purpose of this talk is to look at some compositional strategies to balance the proportion of elements and relate them to the page. So now I'm going to talk about the proportion of elements. The size of your elements should all be related to each other. They can be of simple proportion to each other, say halves, thirds, or quarters, or more dynamically, maybe they relate to each other using the golden section or other irrational proportions. These examples are from Kimberly Elam's Geometry of Design book, and this is definitely a book that I recommend you to pick up. So let's first take a look at this drawing of the Notre Dame Cathedral. We can tell that the dominant part of this building formed a square. The height of the columns is half as tall as the main facade and originate halfway up the building. If you look a bit closer, you can see that the central door fits into the golden section rectangle, which is half the height of the main facade. We can also look at how the golden section rectangle is used to proportion the Parthenon. We can see how it all fits into the golden section grid, such as how the frieze, the architrave, and the pediment, or the roof, fits into the subdivisions of the golden rectangle. But we can also take a look at how it applies to posters. We can also see how proportions work in graphic design. In this Mayakovsky poster, the text is all in proportion to each other in a scale of 2 to 3 to 4. The text sits in blocks which are double the size of the text, and all of this creates a sense of harmony in the design and pulls all the elements together. You can also take a closer look at this image and see how the placement of the text and proportion of the poster relates to or is dictated by the square inscribed within a circle. So now let's take a look at compositional structures. If we use a compositional structure as an overlay, say a page divided into a grid of halves, thirds, or quarters, and we place elements into those cells, then we can be sure that the elements are related in size. This also works if we use other more complicated systems like the golden section or the golden section proportion of 1.62. This strategy also relates all of the elements of the composition to the page dimensions, thereby pulling everything together and creating a unified, holistic composition. So when we first start talking about compositional structures and compositional overlays, let's first take a look at thirds and bisections. So we can easily divide a page into either halves or thirds and subsequently keep dividing it to create a grid. One of the popular strategies is to use a rule of thirds as a compositional guide. We often hear the rule of thirds in photography, and even our phone cameras come with the rule of thirds as a compositional guide. Unlike in photography, though, where we use the intersection points, layout design uses the grid formed when dividing the page into 3. A good art example is Seurat's painting, The Baiser Asnières. We can see how the people in the image fit into the cells, how the person in the hat fits into one cell, and the man laying down fits over 2. You can also see how the top half of the central figure fits into the main central cell. Seurat gives a quiet dynamism by putting the central figure just to the right of the central axis. Also, the diagonal formed by the beach gives a subtle dynamism and energy to the painting. We can also see how the rule of thirds can be applied to graphic design and into poster layout, like in this Kunst auf Zeit poster. The image is divided into 3 equal columns and 2 equal rows, and then in those rows, a diagonal is cut across, which forms the angle and baseline that the text sits on. The triangles formed also contains the text, and all of this text ends at 2/3 of the poster. We can see how the use of diagonals gives this seemingly simple poster a very dynamic feeling. The way the composition relates to the page ties everything together, creating a resolved or finished design. We can also see the combination of halves and thirds in this Le Corbusier poster. The poster is divided into halves, and all the content sits on the left half of the axes. This is also where the bridge is of Le Corbusier's nose. A central square with a width of 1/3 of the page highlights his face. Instead of using thirds, we can even look at dividing the page into halves and continue subdividing it. Looking back to our first lecture about rectangles and proportions, some rectangles' proportions inherently subdivide themselves, like squares or √2 rectangles. This dynamic rectangle can be endlessly subdivided into smaller proportional rectangles, and this is what international sizes of the paper, or A sizes, are based off of, which is in turn based off √2 rectangles, which again have inherent subdivision to them. In this example of a German photography poster, It's also printed on A-size paper, so the grid is inherent in the page size. The poster is first divided into quarters along the height and the width, which forms 16 cells. The text fits on the baseline of the cells, and the image takes up 3 cells in height and 1 5/8 of the cell in width. If you look closer, you can see that the stem of the P lies in the exact center of the image. You can also see how smaller subdivisions of the cell, in pink, inform the margins and placement of the text. Finally, we can end with using the grid formed by the golden section. This is probably the most popular tool in design and layout. Even if it isn't consciously used, it is often used as a measuring stick to analyze successful, effective, or appealing compositions, whether in art, design, sculpture, or architecture. We can look at the application of the subdivided golden rectangle in this poster from Jan Tischold, an important modernist designer and typographer. We can see in this example how the subdivision of the golden rectangle is used to place the content. We can see the width of the main column is a golden ratio 1.62 times the width of the smaller column. We can also see how the text is placed into the thinner column and how it fits into the natural subdivisions. Also note how the poster proportion is also the golden rectangle at 1 to 1.62. You can copy and reflect this grid so the spiral comes from all 4 corners. You can use this grid to analyze and develop your own compositions. I appreciate this grid because you can apply it to non-Western designs, and it often fits. Here are some examples of how it can be used to analyze ukiyo aprons from Hiroshige. I have placed the golden section grid to fit the width of the composition, leaving a slight overhang below the image. You can see in this example how the head of the eagle fits directly into the central column. You can also see how the horizon rests in the middle of the golden rectangle and how the ocean fills the lower modules of the grid. Another detail to note is the location of the calligraphy in the upper right module. Finally, you can even see how the wing follows the arc of the golden section. Remember that you don't necessarily need to even think about it as a grid and use a shape based on the golden section instead, as a pentagram in the Fool's Bougère poster. In this example, the composition fits effortlessly into the pentagram, which also dictates the page size by the width and radiating diagonal lines. So that ends today's lecture. Let me know if you have any questions or if you'd like any of these ideas elaborated on. We will analyze a composition in the next class and also try to quickly put together some designs using these compositional systems. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.